happening, pain after pain. So we rise up together, make a stand for our land. Rise up and say it until we are heard. No, not in my backyard. 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 So things they don't tell you, the research they squash, the laws that they bend to get what they want. It's all for the dollar, it's not for our sake. Let's get the full picture and see what's at stake. As time moves on and we start looking back, why did we do that? We must have been mad. And it's not for our need, it's all for the greed. We're rightly concerned about costly misdeeds, but this just keeps happening again and again all over the world, pain after pain. So we rise up together, make a stand for our land. We rise up and say it until we are heard. No, not in my backyard. 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 No, not in my
So what you'll hear about this evening is this is in everyone's backyard. And so I've asked one more last time if people could please put their cell phones in airplane mode. I'd like to mention this event is being recorded, so as you can probably tell. So if anyone's a bit shy of the camera, best to go behind them. This is an information night only. There's no formal legal or medical advice being given. This is about empowering people and informing people. And one of the things that our campaign has done from the beginning is operate on a philosophy of mutual respect. So, it's our belief very much that, industry, governments, regulators, there'll be a lot of people that actually don't know what we're about to tell you tonight. So, we just extend the common courtesy to everyone and respect and hope for the same. So tonight's agenda is we'll be starting with Mr. Victor Leach on the science and statistics, moving to Dr. Russell Cooper on the health, and then ending with Barrister Raymond Hall on law and liability. We as a community group, you would have seen the flyer and seen our logo, but our journey very briefly was, a DA was applied for in Wilson's Creek. We did our research and reached out to the experts. We became deeply troubled by what was uncovered, and we saw that children are being affected, the environment's being affected, in fact all life on the planet. So we formed this association to, in the first instance, host this event. And it's fairly critical that knowledge is power, so we're very much about empowering people. And we're just like you, we have jobs, we have family, we have mortgages, we love our gadgets, but this is bigger than us. This is the whole planet. And so I'd like those from the team just to stand up and identify yourselves. These are people from your community, and we're all related. Your brothers and sisters that have worked really tirelessly to make this happen. As a community group, we're putting our best best effort. So if we've overlooked something or haven't included someone, we apologise. We appreciate support from local business. You know, we're doing everything properly, so John Robertson Accounting from Mullumbimby is pro bono doing our accounts for us, independently auditing. And, you know, two of the key motivators, there's lots of key motivators, but just, you know, the number one illness that kills children is brain cancer. That's from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And the number one cancer killer of adults under 40 is brain cancer, and that's from the NIHW. The purpose of our association is to educate, empower the people. We call on the government for informed consent, like tobacco. You know, let the people have a choice. We call for independent and expert regulation, and we'll hear about that shortly. A change of the law, not to force a potential carcinogen on people against their will. A moratorium on the 5G rollout, independent research, health, safety and smarter technology, and make those who knowingly continue to harm the people of the Commonwealth of Australia, and I'll rephrase the Commonwealth of Australia, harming the people, are personally accountable under the law. Okay, and just before I hand over, all over the world, parents, scientists and medical doctors have been pleading with politicians, regulators and industry to protect their children. They do not, they will not even their own children. So collectively, we can make a change and we will make a change, and the time to act is now. And I introduce you to Mr. Victor Leach.
Yeah, while we're just setting up the computer arrangement over there, yeah, my name's Victor Leach. I'm a retired radiation health physicist. I've worked for 40 or 50 years in this industry. Most of my work has been in uranium mines, and it's about protecting people, and radiation safety has been at the forefront of all that I've done over those years. And in the last decade, the last 15 years, I've actually got very involved in looking at the non-ionising radiation, that is the radio frequency waves that are being rolled out and being used for communications. Just while we're organising that, I'd just like to I'd like to start off by talking about the current standards that we have, and those standards are delivered by what's called the Internet. If you just go back one, the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation. They're part of the World Health Organisation, and they actually set those standards. Now, the first thing is we decided in the early, about 2.5 years ago, a number of us to actually set up an association, a scientific association, and we realised that we needed to have a number of different types of disciplines involved with us. That's biologists, physicists, endocrinologists, psychologists. We needed a whole range of disciplines to evaluate the science. So we started off looking at how we were going to go about evaluating the science. In the last 15 years, there's been an amount of information in the research literature. So I'll just go back to. You'll need to go to full screen. No, you'll need to go to full screen down here. Yeah, okay, so these guidelines, as I said, the also organisation set up, and we've got a number of members that have got lots of different scientific disciplines. We also have associate members. These are retired people, usually teachers or nurses, that have actually joined our association as supporters, and they're all volunteers. We're not an advocacy group, we're about the science, and that's what we wanted to do, is to look at the science and look at it free from being linked to any industry, and to look at the science independently. So if we go to the next slide, next slide, next slide. So I'll just wait for the next slide. Anyway, so, no, that's, you've got to begin. Hang on, wait, I've got a few technical difficulties here. Can you just go to the beginning? Can you go to the beginning of the presentation? Just. That's right. No, go to the end of the presentation. Yeah, do it, Steve. No, do it, Steve, please. Yeah, sorry, we've just got a bit of a technical problem. I'm actually a bit of an Apple lover. I hate Microsoft because they're always difficult. You need to go. Yeah. Okay, okay, that'll do. Yeah, we'll move on from there, Steve. Now, there are many disciplines involved, and as we said, the first thing we decided to do was to set up a database and to categorise all the scientific papers into effect papers, no effect papers, uncertain effect papers. So we decided to go through the process of categorising those papers, and we've put into the database 3,100 papers. Now they're actually accessible on the web. Anybody can go there and actually look and do research and do their own research. Next slide, please. Now, I think this is sort of very instructive because when you look at this, you can see there's we're looking from outer space, we're looking from a satellite, we're looking at large bushfires. And this is very instructive because we're actually seeing a lot of smoke. We can't actually see the fire, but there's a lot of smoke there. So one would believe that possibly there's a fire under there, and I think we all know there is. There was a huge bushfire there in Victoria. And this, I want to keep that in mind as I go through the slides, so you actually get a feel for what I'm on about in terms of the science. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. What we did in our database, we actually put in a whole lot of papers, and you'll notice there there's 663 in vivo papers. Okay, what that means is they're cell studies, okay? They're test tube studies, cell studies, we've irradiated the papers, the researchers have irradiated the sample, and they've looked for changes in the cell structure. You'll notice there's 1,033 what they call in vivo studies. Now they're animal studies. They're studies that are actually where you irradiate the animal, and then you do that for a number of weeks, or it could be days, it could be years. And then what you do is you sacrifice the animal and you look for changes in the animal. You look for tumours that have been developed after these animals have been exposed. Most of them are rats and mice, but there are also primates in there. We've also exposed primates to RF radiation. You'll see their provocation studies. Now what they are, those studies are where they put people in a room and switch on an antenna and see whether they feel the radiation. Now that's actually, when you think about it, it's pretty silly. Because, I mean, you can go and have an X-ray and you won't feel the X-ray. If you were exposed, say for example, if you go to the sun and you get exposed to the sun, right, for a number of hours, it won't be until next day that you actually will find that you've got sunburn. Okay, so biological systems aren't linear. They're not linear systems. So when you expose somebody to electromagnetic radiation, radio frequency radiation, or you don't get a direct effect. It happens sometime later. So they're a bit silly. These studies are a bit silly. And then we've got epidemiological studies. Now these are disease studies. These are where we go into the hospitals and we interview people who have got brain tumours, and we develop profiles on those people. And we group them into how many hours they've actually used the telephone for against their ear. So we actually build up a profile of the disease. Now those studies, the problem with those studies is there's lots and lots of confounders in those studies. They're very difficult studies to do. And the biggest study that was done was the interphone study, and that was back in 2000, 2004, which was a very large study. So there's lots of problems in doing these studies, but even when they did these studies, they showed that if a person using a mobile phone glued to their ear for in excess of 50 minutes a day, and they did that for in excess of 5 years, and particularly out to 10 years, the risk factors for them getting a brain cancer was actually significant. It wasn't insignificant. This study, when it was done, the actual results weren't published straight away. It took almost 4 years for those results to be published. And then the media, when it came out in the media, they said, but this, we didn't detect any brain, there's no relationship, no statistical relationship between brain cancer and these studies. Might go to the next one. The problem with these studies is that we talk about the precautionary approach, and the precautionary approach is actually triggered by two factors. One is the strength of evidence. That is, we're seeing all that smoke, that's the strength of evidence that there might be a bushfire under there. And the other one is the potential cost of doing nothing. And it can be many, many years between discovering that people have got a health problem, and in particular asbestos. In 1898, scientific papers were written that people had chest complaints. They were working in mines where there was asbestos, free asbestos in the air, and they were finding these people had lung conditions. That was 1898. They actually didn't ban it until 101 years later. So there's often a long time between exposure and we actually get around to doing anything. And in particular, the second one there, Dr. John Snow, who was an English physician, he was basically the father of epidemiology, disease studies. And what he did, he plotted the people who were dying in Soho, and he realised they were all centred around as well. And he thought that the water was the problem, that the people were getting sick and dying because of the water. So this was the first epidemiological study, the first disease study. And so what he did, he actually took the pump off the well, so they couldn't drink the water, and all of a sudden he discovered that that people weren't getting sick anymore. So he knew the problem was in the water, the problem was in the water, but it wasn't until 29 years later that we actually knew why. That it was cholera bacteria that was actually creating it. So there's often smoking as well. Richard Dole, in 1952, he wrote up lung cancer versus smoking. He did a survey and found there was a problem, and he gave his talk at the Royal College of Surgeons. But, I was on a plane in 1970, and I can remember that you smoked at the back of a plane. You were still allowed to smoke at the back of the plane. So it took a long time before we actually did something. And next slide, thanks. And now, the people who set these standards, or reference levels that people are exposed to, that is occupational standards and non-occupational standards, there are two bodies. One's called ICRP, International Commission on Radiological Protection, and the other one that sets the RS standards is called ICNIRP, International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. You probably think that they're similar names, they're probably related organisations. Wrong. They're completely different organisations. They have nothing much to do with one another. The first organisation looks after X-rays and gamma rays and set standards, but when it gets to low dose X-rays and gamma rays, they actually take a precautionary stance, and so they're more like risk managers. So they're very, very, very careful at low doses, whereas the people setting the standards for ICNIRP, setting the standards, the Australian standard that it's based on, they actually want certainty. They want to know there's cause and effect. They want to know there's a positive cause and effect before they'll actually take any action. So the precautionary approach doesn't even enter into their philosophy. Next slide, please. Yeah, and as I said there, the ICRP, which is a non-profit organisation established in 1928, they're very careful, and they have concepts as low as reasonably achievable. Those concepts don't, in the RF space, the radiation space, for people who are getting exposed to RF radiation, there's no concepts of precaution whatsoever. They've set the levels so high, they actually, they're based on cooking, heating. It's basically a microwave, okay? So the only effects they take into account are heating effects. Any biological effects that happen below that heating level, they basically ignore. But they do say that the children and the elderly and some chronically ill people might have a lower tolerance to this radiation, but they don't do anything about it. It's basically the precautionary approach they don't adopt. It's basically not even looked at. And this is I was talking a little bit about lung cancers. When you do these disease studies, when you look up there, you find 51% of the studies show effect. There's quite a large number of studies that show are uncertain, and there's you've got no effect studies. And another organisation within WHO classified RF radiation as a possible carcinogen. Now, when they did that classification, they didn't take into account any of the animal studies. They weren't looked at. They only looked at the disease studies. They only looked at the epidemiology. They completely ignored all the animal studies. And I'll show you, as we'll show later on, that they actually are important. So, as I said, when they did that study, the largest industry study was the Interphone study. 4 years later, they came out and said, "Oh, there's no link between brain cancer and the use of mobile phones. There's none whatsoever." Well, that's true, but only for people who use a mobile phone for 1 or 2 hours a week. Those people who actually use the mobile phone for in excess of 50 minutes a day, and they continue to do that for about 5 years, and in particular the group in 10 years, the risk factors were quite significant. They weren't trivial, and so there was basically a real problem there. These studies are very difficult to do. You've got to find a population who don't use a mobile phone. That's going to be pretty well impossible in the future to do these studies, because there's 9 million people in this world, and there's 9 billion people in this world, and there's 5 billion mobile phones. So it's going to be really difficult to do these sorts of studies in the future. The other thing I'd like to say, and it's quite interesting, they excluded, in that study, they excluded young adults and children. They weren't part of that study. They excluded them. And if you died because you had brain cancer during the study, they basically weren't counted in the study at all. So there was a lot of fudging of the data, and in particular, one of the things that was really quite interesting when they looked at whether you were a left-handed or a right-handed person. As soon as they did that, and they found the tumour was on the left side or the right side, there was actually the studies which had no effect actually became effect studies, because those tumours followed which side of your ear you actually had the mobile phone up to. So these studies aren't easy to do, and there's lots of flaws. But even with all these flaws, there still came out with risk factors for those people who were considered to be heavy users. Now, a heavy user, as I said, it was more than 50 minutes a day. So if you've got that phone glued to your ear and you continue to do that more than 50 minutes a day, you're moving into another risk regime. Next slide, thanks. A PANSA, you've heard of PANSA, they're the Commonwealth Regulatory Authority. Well, they're not really the regulatory authority. They're a pseudo-regulatory authority. They only issue guidelines. There's a real problem there, and there's no independent, really, organisation as such. But PANSA produced a report in 2014 that came out, and they reviewed the science from the year 2000 to 2012. They looked at all the papers and they reviewed the science. Now these are the test tube studies, these are the cell studies, and you can see that the first column says genotoxic, 16 effect studies. We found 34 because their database, we actually got a copy of their database and actually loaded it in our database and categorised it and had a look to see whether there were, how many effect studies and no effect studies were in there. And we got a completely different result. And if you go down there and you look at gene expressions, the exposure of these cells, they only found 4 studies that had effect, and 10 studies that had no effect, and we found 71 in their own database. 1,354 papers they had, and they delivered it to us in a text file, which actually took a long time actually getting in our database and categorising it. We also have Professor Henry Lye's papers, his collection. He's a researcher. He's an emeritus professor. He's one of our advisors. He actually gave us his lifetime collection of papers, and he classified them into effect and no effect studies. And we put his papers in there, but we can actually look at the PANSA group, and you can see there that they were saying it's 50-50. Up there on the right-hand side there, you said 46-54, and we said no, it's probably more like 68-30. And that's their own data. Next slide, thanks. And these are the living organisms. These are the rats and mice that get exposed. and you can actually look for the bioeffects. And when you go down, for example, if you look at the first one, they said, oh, we only found 21 papers that showed effect, and 17 no effect, and we found 72 in their own database. So what the hell is going on? This Commonwealth Authority that doing this review of the evidence and presenting it to us, what are they doing? Well, and you can see down there the very last one, oxidative stress, which is a big one, 124 papers, and they didn't even look at that. They discounted the bioeffect of oxidative papers. They just completely didn't bother about it. And we got 124 papers that show effect and 10 no effect. This is in their own database. So what were they doing? Why did they collect this 1,354 papers that they were going to analyse? Why didn't they look at the data, the science? That's what they were supposed to do. Next slide. So yeah, so the expert reviewer.
Have they been challenged on this at all?
Yes, I'll tell you more about that. Yeah, you betcha. Anyway, on top of that, the expert reviewer, he didn't look at their database. He didn't look at all the papers they collected. We did. They didn't bother doing that. He just basically used another review, a health department, UK health department review. He basically looked at that, and he basically just repeated the evidence that the UK Department of Health repeated, and there were real problems with that evidence. And Dr. Sarah Starkey, who's a neurologist in the UK, said, look, that review was terrible. It's scientifically inaccurate. The conclusions did not reflect the evidence. You can sort of see that for yourself. And the studies were admitted. Oxidative stress was not given coverage. The fertility effects were ignored. The cognitive effects were ignored. The behavioural effects were ignored. They were all misrepresented. So it appears that TR164, this review that our Commonwealth Government was doing, was a terrible review. And we said to them, this is terrible. You know, I presented this at a Wollongong Australian Radiation Protection Society conference, and I said, this is a terrible review. You should pull this report off the shelf. It's bad. It's bad science. And you were supposed to be setting the levels. So what do you think they did? They said, oh no, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. And we said, no, there's everything wrong with it. You should put it in the trash can. That's where it needs to go. Anyway, we keep arguing about that, but we're actually going to write a scientific paper. We're going to embarrass them even further. Next slide. So when you look at human studies, these are animal studies where human beings are actually irradiated, and you can't do what you can do with animal studies. You can't irradiate a human being and then sacrifice him and look at the changes in the organs and body fluids. So we've got to work around it. And 51 effect studies, basically what we do is sample blood and saliva and skin and sperm, and we look for changes. And we've got 51 effect studies, 10 no effect studies. And you can see there on the right hand side we've got DNA damage, biochemical changes, altered enzyme cases. There's only a small number of human studies, very few, because we've got to work on what we can get from human beings, which is urine or faeces or blood or saliva. So there's some evidence there that there's bioeffects. Next slide. So here we go. These are the animal studies, okay, mainly rats and mice. And when you look at the animal studies, the group 1 up there, you see there's 366 effect studies and 85 no effect studies. And so but then you look at the left-hand side and you see most of these studies are short-term studies. They're not long-term studies. We've only got, as you go down, you find that the long-term, there's only a few handful of long-term studies. And what do you find? What changes do you find? You find biochemical changes, altered enzyme activity, oxidative stress, all these biochemical, all these biological markers. And particularly when you get to the longer term studies, you find that DNA starts to move up in the ranking. DNA damage. So if you we'll go to the next slide. Thanks. Yeah, sorry, just getting a bit drawn out. So when you go to, when you look at the animal studies. Now, these are studies, as I said before, the actual current levels are set on the basis of thermal heating. So we have what are called non-thermal exposures. So when we isolate all those exposures that are to do at much lower levels, we actually find all these effects. We find 207 papers that actually show at these lower exposure levels actually show effect and no effect. And there's a little wedge up there with 9 effect positive studies, and that means that the researcher has actually said, no, maybe there's some benefit in a little bit of irradiation that probably triggers the immune system, and maybe there's some benefit in this. Well, we've always known this. We've always known at these lower levels that it can be used for also for therapy as well. So that's not something all that new. In fact, we've used RF for bone healing, and Dr. Cooper there can talk more about that. But there's always been some small benefit that may result. So there is a small wedge there, but overwhelmingly, most of these studies show that there's a detriment rather than benefit. Next slide. And the other thing we can do with the ORSA database is we can pull out, we can look at the studies, particularly the animal studies, which use real mobile phone signals, and those that are simulated. When they do these studies, they use real mobile phones to irradiate the animals, or they use simulated signals. And when you look at that, you'll see there the first line, 120 effect studies and 18 no effect studies. Well, that's pretty convincing that these mobile phone signals are pretty bioactive. And when you look at the simulated phone signals, you see that it's not so clear. So real mobile phone signals are a lot more bioactive. That's what I'm saying. Next one. These are all the in the ORSA database. We can do a summary of all the biological effects, and there's a whole heap of them there. Next slide. When we look at mobile phone towers, well, how many experiments do we really have? How many epidemiological studies would we really have? Well, there's only, this is worldwide, there's only 29. And you can see there that overwhelmingly there's a lot more effect studies than no effect studies. And the other thing, the 4 no effect studies, I just want you to note there that it's those studies were done by the German government and the UK Telecom. So, and I'll tell you more about that as we go through the slides. So there's not many studies. If you move down, next slide, and you can see there that in Australia there's not a single study in Australia that has been carried out on mobile phone base stations, right? So not a single one, right? Not one. And the only one that actually, the study that was carried out, I don't know if you remember, there used to be a tower in Willoughby, a TV tower. Well, they actually did some research. They looked at the childhood leukemia in the surrounding areas, and they'd look at all the population within 500 metres, 1,000 metres. These are TV antennas. These signals are all bioelectric. They're all bioactive. And when the person who did that study was Dr. Bruce Hocking, who was Chief Medical Officer for Telstra. Well, he wasn't very popular with Telstra, and he was basically shown the door eventually. But if you have a look at that, but that's not RF. That's very high frequencies, TV frequencies. And there's a few others. But if you look at the last one, this is really interesting, because the US Embassy in Moscow, the Russians decided to irradiate the US Embassy in Moscow. Now, I don't know how it came that the US found out that they were actually being radiated by RF radiation, but it went on for a number of years, between 1953 and 1978. So the Russians were actually, maybe they were trying to stop them transmitting radio transmitting signals from the actual their embassy, and that's why they were doing it. But the levels in which they were actually exposing them to were that limit. That limit of that's based on heating is right up here, and they were exposing them to about 3%. It was much lower levels. And the frequencies they were using, they actually engaged this Linner field to go back and interview all the previous staff and to find out whether they had any health issues. And what did they find? They were radiated for 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for something like 2 to 4 years. These people were radiated, the staff, and they went back and they found that the symptoms were eczema and psoriasis, the skin problems, and allergy and inflammation reactions. So that was actually quite interesting, quite an interesting observation that was made. And in particular, the skin one, the fact that skin conditions were actually highlighted, because with the higher frequencies, with the new 5G, with the higher frequencies, actually the radiation is going to be attenuated in the skin mainly. So, and of course, the skin is a very large organ. If you go to the next slide, thanks. Because of the ORSA database, we actually, when we put the paper in there, we actually look to see who's funded the research. And when you do that, you find that if it's institutionally funded only, that is the universities are actually sponsoring the research, you find a lot more effect studies than no effect studies. But when industry is funding the research, actually the situation gets reversed. So there's the information's being distorted. The research is being distorted by the money. Who's funding the research? If you go to the next slide, we also, in the ORSA database, we actually take note of what country the primary researcher is actually doing the work. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the countries like China, their researchers published 141 effect papers and 13 no effect papers. So the Chinese researchers are finding a lot more effect papers and no effect papers. And the countries on the left there, you can see Sweden 66 to 13 and Russia 40 to 20. And as soon as you move across, wait a question time, I think. As soon as you move across to those countries like DEU is Germany, you find there's more. They produce a lot more no effect papers than effect papers, and Great Britain 34 to 22. And remember, I said those 4 mobile phone base station papers were actually being produced in Germany and also in the UK, and it's not a surprise really. And you've got to think Finland, for example, small country, but it's got Nokia, you know. There's a bit of industry protection happening there. And the interesting thing about all this is that the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians are actually listening to their researchers, and they've set a level. Currently, as I said, the ignorant level is set up here, and they've set a level 100 times lower. So they're listening to their researchers, and they've decided to go for a much lower level. Next slide. Oh yeah, just is any of this new? Well, no. You know, all this mobile phone, all this has come from the military. It's basically a military invention. And of course, the military knew about this back in 1976, so none of this is actually new. It's being obscured somewhat. And you can see there that the military noticed in their military personnel that, you know, were exposed to RF radiation, that they got headaches, fatigue, they got dizzy, disorders, irritability, depression. You know, all the things that we're seeing in population groups, you know, are being seen here. So next slide. So, you know, identify risks. Well, yeah, we can identify the risks. Brain cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurodegenerative, you know, there's a whole stack of risks. So if you go down, next slide, chronic diseases, well, The top health burdens, and Dr. Russell Cooper will speak more about this, is cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, etc. And, you know, I asked the question, you know, is EMR actually playing a role in this? Because the actual background level of EMR that was here on this planet before all this stuff came is anywhere between 1 billion and one with 18 zeros after it, or one with 9 zeros, so somewhere in between there, depending on where you are on this planet. We have increased the background at least 1 billion-fold with this technology. And you've got to ask the question, is that having an effect on the population? In particular, our children, you know, they'll have a lifetime of this. You know, I'm an old person, I won't be around for the next 20 years from now, I'll be gone. But you've got to remember, our children are actually growing up with this their whole life. And it's cranking up all the time, and there seems to be no restriction. We're all part of a huge biological experiment here. Because as I said, the long-term effects, you know, we just don't have that evidence. And if you go to the next slide, so what I'm saying to you is converging evidence on health effects are these levels that are much lower than the current thermal level which is set. But basically they have a license to do whatever they want because they're never going to exceed this thermal level, you know, the level inside the microwave. It's never going to be exceeded, this heating level. But we're seeing evidence of biological effects at much lower levels, what we call non-thermal levels, which is very troubling. And they're real. They're not figments of our imagination. The telecom people, I went to a conference down in Melbourne, and the telecommunications people said, oh, there's no evidence. There's no evidence no health evidence. Oh, all these bioeffects, they don't really add up to anything. There's no real health evidence here. There's not a problem, you know. We'll just keep motoring it out. And so I ask you, is there enough smoke to say we've probably got a fire happening? And and the other thing too is that we need stronger consumer advice, particularly around children. We need to be, they're going to have a lifetime of this exposure, and of course they don't even, and a lot of these studies, they're not even considered, you know, as I said, the interphone study, and considered. I mean, the interphone study is 2000, 2004, it's an old study. You know, the number of, you know, it's tools of the trade these days. You know, mobile phones are tools of the trade. You know, we should be telling people that not to plug it up to their ear, you know. And how many people know that the manufacturer says you've got to have a gap, an air gap between the phone and your ear? You know, we should be really starting to give that advice out. I'll just leave you with the final. What we've been plugging for is for the precautionary approach to be adopted. And what I'd like to leave with you is that we believe the trigger point has been reached, and the precautionary approach needs to be applied to this technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Well, I'll hand the mic back to Victor to take questions while Dr. Cooper gets set up. Are you aware that the telcos cannot get insurance for harm caused by mobile phones in the towers? That's how risky this is.
Okay. I think there was a lady over there who wanted to ask a question. She put her hand up.
Oh, can we get people to come down to the front and use the microphone?
Oh, sorry?
So we can hear it. Can we get people to come to the front?
Do you want me to come over here?
No, there's a microphone.
Okay, I've got that. Okay. Yep, it's on now. Okay, yep.
It's not loud.
Most of the information is taken on mobile phones is about 3G phones, not about 4G phones.
No, it's
Can you just ask, sorry, can you ask that question again so we can get you on?
You were talking about the effects from mobile phones. Is all the information that we gathered over the years is just about 2G and 3G, not 4G phones? And is it true that 4G phones, there's not much information yet still coming out, and is it true that they're 4 times more powerful than 3G phones?
The interesting thing about, there is a lot of studies done on 4G phones, but the change in technology has meant the modulation patterns are a little bit different. And it's those modulation patterns that are more bioactive. The other thing too, and I didn't mention this, is that wireless phones in your home, the one where you pull it out from the base station and you walk around, they're actually basically a mobile phone because they're using the same sorts of frequencies and the modulation patterns are very similar. So, there are quite a lot of studies on 4G phones and they're a lot more bioactive. The other thing I should say too is that when they do these studies, they look at the cumulative number of hours used. Now, that actually isn't such a good indicator of exposure because here in the country, where your mobile phone signal is weaker, the actual mobile phone cranks up, the power goes up to get connection. I don't know if you've ever experienced, you put your mobile phone in a glove box and you're driving through the country and you pick it up and the battery's flat. And you think, I haven't used it, what's going on? Because it's spending all its time at high power trying to connect to mobile phone tower as you're driving along, so the battery goes flat. So people in the city, where they've got good signal strength, their exposure, say for a 10-minute phone call, is actually going to be lower. Now, even with all those sorts of problems with doing epidemiological studies, it still shows evidence that for heavy users, and I say heavy users, and there's been other studies, the CERNET study has also followed on from the Interphone study, and a heavy user, 50 minutes a day with a mobile phone glued to his ear, I think there's be a lot more people in that category now. So they come up, the latency period is the thing where you need a number of years before these statistics start to show up. But all the evidence is that, mobile phones are a problem.
We'll take one more question and then during the break, which will be at 6:30, where there's tea and coffee and soup, you're welcome to find the speakers and ask more questions.
Okay.
Brief question. You mentioned the 3,100 papers that you've got cited somewhere.
Yep.
Are they available as PDFs? And I also did a similar thing, gathering up papers on in my area of wildlife. And I found there's very, very few, barely any studies in classes, scientific, on the effects on wildlife of both EMR and radio frequency phones. We were doing wildlife surveys and using one of that ultra-high frequency detection units for working out bats, presence or absence in development areas, and where there were towers or high voltage power lines, there's less activity of bats, and strongly suggesting that there's some kind of effect on wildlife that's unmeasured, but certainly it's very suspicious. In other words, the bats are just not there or in very low numbers. And so that's what I'm particularly interested in, what studies have been done on the effects of wildlife. I think it's possibly a very serious issue for wildlife.
Yeah, I think you did right there. There's certainly been quite a few studies on bees where they put mobile phones in the beehive and the bees haven't returned to the hive. They certainly it causes navigational problems. Where there's mobile phone tower been put near a beehive. There's quite a few studies on that. I might get you a name and I can actually send you some stuff here. But we've done studies on plants as well as insects. It is a problem to the wildlife. We're filling up the environment with all this environmental radiation and not really considering what it's actually doing to other animals, and insects in particular. Yep.
I've been living up on Mount Nardi, which hosts a mothership of towers that has been there forever.
Yep.
And I'm about a kilometre away from the towers, but Interesting enough, when they introduced 3G towers to Mount Nardi, about 30% of the wildlife disappeared.
Yeah.
And that was in 2009.
Yeah.
But when they stuck a 4G tower up in 2013-14, 60% of the wildlife disappeared overnight.
Okay, yeah.
That's the big difference.
Yeah, the modulation.
But understanding that Mount Nardi is a mothership and it does connect to all the other towers. It's the most powerful installation in the district.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. There are limited. Again, nobody's really doing a lot of research. There's sort of limited research in that area. Great. Yeah, but we've got quite a few papers in the database regarding that, and if you want copies, you can just I'll give you my email and I can send you some copies.
Thank you, thank you. I'll now hand the... I'll now hand the floor over to Dr. Russell Cooper, who has more degrees than a thermometer and is certainly an expert.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for taking your Saturday afternoon off for this extraordinary event. Steve, thank you for inviting me, and to everyone here today, I hope this will be an important day for you. Some of you are obviously very technically savvy, and that's wonderful. Some of you may not be. I'm going to sort of pitch it up and down so that we all feel that we gained something from today. I think what the musicians did was absolutely outstanding. If they're still in the room, guys, congratulations. It was heartfelt, it was soul, there was science there was love there was environment there was reality there. And thank you, Victor, for your presentation. And a lot of the things that you said, I'm going to elaborate on. I'm going to see this more from a medical point of view. I'm an integrative trained doctor. I've been in clinical practice for 38 years. I did my initial training in South Africa. I've done my nutritional and environmental training in Australia. I'm board certified in anti-aging medicine in America. I've done preventive medicine training for my Master of Science in Germany, and I keep studying and keep learning because this is life and there's always more that we all need to learn and live as we travel through life. But all of this comes down to how I can care for my patients and for the people I love. Importantly, I have a lot of people who are sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. I have a large population of patients. I speak from my experience. These are people who are genuinely very unwell. I'm going to talk about them later in the presentation. The condition is called electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But the main reason I'm here is because I'm concerned about what's going on. I'd like to join the dots between the research and the boots on the ground stuff, people that actually walk in and sit with me and tell me their woes, and see if we can find a way through this for them. Just some housekeeping. Any bolding of the script is my bolding, especially when I've quoted the information, really just for emphasis. All photos are my own, or I've bought them, or I've referenced them. And so, as I understand, our phones are off already. Remember, you're not turning your phones off for me, but you're turning them off for you. Because if they're in your pocket, that could be a major problem. So let's get going. What do you reckon? Okay, so already we've heard about the Alpanza standard. This is an extraordinary document. Thank goodness it's a document that protects us from thermal effects of radiation. But as we've heard, possibly it doesn't protect us from the non-thermal effects in the 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz range. As you've heard, Alpanza is based on the ICNIRP, the ICNIRP Commission for the Protection of Non-Ionizing Radiation. This is a European-based company, and many bodies around the world use a similar ICNIRP classification for their standards. In the forward of the standard, in the document which I have with me, this is the Alpanza standard. hold it closer to my mouth. Okay, there's currently a level of concern about radio frequency which is not fully alleviated by existing scientific data. It is true that the data regarding biological effects at levels below the limits specified in the standard are incomplete and inconsistent. So that is recognized by our Panzer, and they say that research is continuing in many countries. And that's great. But they also say in the standard that the standard discusses a public health precautionary approach to RF fields. Remember, RF is radio frequency. Radio frequency is 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz in the electromagnetic spectrum. And they say this is not a simple matter. There are costs involved adopting precautions, which is extraordinary, but true. They go on to say that there is, and that the science does not at all establish even indicative parameters on which a precautionary approach may be based. Or we can say, well, who's analyzing the science, as we heard from Victor today. And I'm going to talk with you a bit later about the enormous volume of science that is available. And I apologize to the trees for having to print this out, but I thought it's important to recognize that there are thousands upon thousands. In fact, there isn't an adjective big enough to describe how many studies are now showing the harmful effects of electromagnetic radiation. Okay. So are we really protected? Are we protected? So as I said, the standard is not designed to protect us in the non-ionizing radiation zone, and that the standard does not disclose 24-hour exposure levels. In fact, the standard is based on 6 minutes of exposure for less than 10 gigahertz, and only a few seconds or microseconds of exposure for above 10 gigahertz. So what about your baby sleeping in a room for 12 to 15 hours being exposed to Wi-Fi, to radio frequency from towers? These are questions we need to ask. What about the heating effect that takes place? So the International Academy for the Research into Cancer, as we have heard back in 2011, classified EMF, radio frequency, as a group B possible carcinogen in the same category as lead and some other poisonous chemicals. However, all the way back in 2002, IARC classified extremely low magnetic fields. These are the magnetic fields coming out of transmission wires as also group B, being possibly carcinogenic. So let's look at some of the studies. Rather than doing what Victor did of taking a compilation of studies, I'm going to cherry pick. I'm going to take you into the world of some of these studies and look at individual studies just to get an idea, a flavor of what's going on. So these are leukemia childhood studies. Schultz, for example, in 2000 did a case-controlled study of 514 cases, 514 children with leukemia. And what was found was that the flux density, which is the measurement of the electromagnetic fields with regard to these power line cables, which is measured in micro Tesla, and I'll go into this in a moment, anything over 0.2 to 0.4 microtesla had a higher incidence. You'll keep seeing the word odds ratio, a higher odds ratio of there being a problem. And you can see in the 0 to 2 to 0.4 microtesla range, there was increased risk of leukemia by, so the odds ratio is 1.2, that's a 20% increase. Greater than 4%, greater than 0.4 microtesla, the risk went up fivefold, so 5 times more. So about a 500% increased chance of leukemia. Another study on, again from the IARC monograph. If you look at the monograph at the bottom, volume 80, page 114, enormous number of documents that have been collected on childhood cancers. And this was 716 children, and again the distance from this 200 kilovolt power line substation was primarily responsible for the exposure to magnetic fields. Levels over greater than 0.3 microtesla increased the odds ratio by 2 times, a 2-fold increased risk. And similarly with this Danish study of children, similar odds ratios, again over 0.25. Just for central nervous system tumors, there was no obvious risk, but malignant lymphomas went up to an odds ratio of 5, and the field strength over 0.4 microtesla for leukemia was 6, so 600% increased risk. There's been a wonderful paper by 3 very eminent professors, Professor Belpomme from France, Professor Hardell from Sweden, Professor Bellier from Bratislava in the old Yugoslavia, which is now called Slovakia, I understand. Dr. Bergio and Dr. Carpenter, who's been one of the principal authors of this extraordinary document called the Bio-Initiative Report. And what they said was the scientific evidence for harm from EMF is increasingly strong. We do not advocate going back to the age where before electricity or wireless communication, but we deplore the present failure of the public health and international bodies to recognize the scientific data showing the adverse effects of EMF on human health. And these were the things that we heard earlier from Victor. Unfortunately, standards set by most national and international bodies are not protective on human health. This is of particular concern to our most vulnerable being our children. Given the rapid expansion use of wireless technologies, and we know from our own kids, when we're busy, what do? We give them the phone to play their games. And how do they play their games? With their phone on their lap, very close to very vital organs, and we think nothing of it. And the problem is our babies, our children, they have a much greater susceptibility of developing disease because their organs are growing. The very cells, the very growth factors that grow their bodies are the very growth factors that cause cancer. This is called pleiotrophism, which means things that can do us good can do us harm at the same time. So we need to look after them as we do with absolute care. The greater protection of radio frequency radiation relative to head size and the potential of longer lifetime exposure. Great, thanks. Fantastic. You know, we use technology when it works for us, and we move beyond it when it doesn't. So I'll just have to keep this close to my mouth. Okay. So the same authors continued by saying, continually increasing exposure to EMF from all sources may contribute to rising brain cancer in children. After 2000 in Sweden, Hardell's work found this, as did a New English study by Phillips in England and Spanish studies. And there are other groups as well that have found this as well. This is becoming a groundswell, so much so that the French government have removed Wi-Fi from preschools and ordered Wi-Fi to be shut off in elementary schools when not in use. Isn't that amazing? And that is the start. In California, the use of mobile phones has special warnings and and advice is being offered on how to reduce exposure. So many of these steps are neither difficult nor expensive. It's actually common sense. It's about awareness. It's like knowing when we want to use technology, to use it safely, and then to turn it off and get rid of it when we're sleeping, for example. You know, we tell our children not to sleep with the phone under their pillow. You know that one? Not to have the phone next to them. To remove all electronics from nearby them, because there are magnetic waves coming, there are electric waves coming from the plugs. There's Wi-Fi in the house. If you have Wi-Fi in your house, things need to be turned off at night. We're not in use. So we need to protect our children. ICNURC's SAR is specific absorption ratios, or actually based on adult phantoms. What is specific absorption ratio is when you put a phone to your ear, children, the plume of the radio frequency goes much deeper into the brain than in an adult. And so the researchers, Belpoma and his colleagues, have said that the assumptions that it's safe to use mobile phones are invalid. One, because kids absorb radiation far more, but also because they're the non-thermal effects of radiation, not just the thermal effects. And as we've seen, the non-thermal effects are the very effects that can cause conditions like cancer. But we're also going to hear that non-thermal effects can affect the brain, the organization of the brain, an increased risk of autism, an increased risk of other neurodevelopmental effects, how children sleep, their cognition, their performance, their anxiety. All of this can get worse. And so, as I've described here, we can see the plume moving through the head from contact. This is an extraordinary document by Dr. Martha Herbert, a pediatric neurologist. She's a neuroscientist. She's on Harvard Medical School's faculty. She's at the Massachusetts General Hospital on the faculty there as well. And she's a co-author for this extraordinary document, the Bio-Initiative Report. And unless I've misread, the update, the Alpanza update, does not even make a one-word reference to the Bio-Initiative Report. She did a 60-page document with 550 citations on the relationship between autism and electromagnetic radio frequency. And without a doubt, she feels that there's a contribution between the exposure of people to all these wonderful toys and devices we have and the change of their behavior. She notes that there are thousands of papers documenting the adverse effects and neurological impacts. And we need to protect these very vulnerable little beings. There are studies talking about intracranial tumors, salivary gland tumors. This is a meta-analysis of 26,000 cases. And they found that, as we heard from Victor, the short-term use of mobile phones, there doesn't appear to be any obvious problem. But then it all depends on how the methodology of the study was set up. But more than 10 years is a problem, and how long we use the phone for. And as I heard, even though I was back there just relaxing before my big moment, how close the phone was never designed to be touching the air. The product information always says, as I heard you mention, to be away from the ear. So when we're in a busy area where you can't put your phone on speaker and you put it to your ear, you are actually endangering yourself. Wherever possible, have it at the furthest distance away from your lovely little devices, EMF measuring devices, which can actually tell you, sort of boots on the ground stuff, what readings you're getting as far as power density. Okay, and this is another meta-analysis for glioma risk, and very similar risks over 10 years of use, or 1,640 hours, I think is the number, or very similar to that, where the risk increases. Okay. So this is fascinating. This was a meta-analysis which was done on the risk of brain tumors, or a systematic review of meta-analyses between the study quality, the source of funding, and the research outcomes. Doesn't that sound interesting? Because what we're hearing is when industry, thank you, stick your hand up if I get slack. When industry funds a study, what sort of result do you think we get?
No effect.
No effect. And isn't that unfortunate? What they found in this study was that studies with a higher quality showed a trend towards a higher risk of brain tumors. And studies with a lower quality showed a trend towards a lower risk. And what was Alpanza's comment on it? Well, there's the reference. This is in the new Alpanza update, that they recognized that over 10 years there's an increased risk of brain tumors, that the risk being 1.33 or 33% increased. And yet extraordinarily in their 2017 research update, they still deem that there's no causality between mobile phones and radio frequency. And here they concluded that, the report concluded that the science behind the Alpanza RF standard in their update remains sound and that the exposure limits of the standard continue to provide a high degree of protection against known health effects of REEME, electromagnetic energy, they use that word. But professionally, I do not consider risk of brain cancer after 10 years mobile phone use a high degree of protection. And most of us have used mobile phones a lot more than 10 years and possibly more than 1,640 hours. And that puts all of us at risk. So let's look at these numbers. I've been given access to the telco company's information document on the Wilson Creek tower, and you can see these strange, VPM, we're going to talk about that, volts per meter, which is the field strength, and you'll see all these UW per M2, so that's microwatts per meter squared, or microwatts per centimeter squared. Let's see if this, yeah, microwatts per centimeter squared, okay. Watts per kilogram is the SAR, the specific absorption into the brain. So we're going to look at these units, because when you understand your units, then it empowers you to understand, and especially if you've got a little measuring device, what you're actually being exposed to. It becomes something very real and something that you can adjust and check again to make sure that your exposure reduces. So for magnetic fields, we use the term flux density. And you will normally see this nomenclature microtesla. And you saw those studies we were looking at with leukemia children was in microtesla. Now, where is it? Okay. I've got a little measuring device here. There it is. So this is a milligaussian device. Milligauss. And you'll see when I put it near these things, it goes crazy. When I put it near my computer, it goes crazy as well. But when I come back, there's a certain point where the signal reduces. So even, gosh, look at this, even when I'm standing here. So you need to be a full arm's length away from your computer. So what is happening when you've got your computer on your lap, the proverbial laptop? You're irradiating your lower body. Okay, so we measure in microtesla. Remember, a microtesla is 10 times less than milligauss. So sorry, I'll just go back one. So you can see, is the cursor working on the screen or not?
No. No.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So there you can see microtesla 0.02 and milligauss is 0.2. So you can see the German building biologists. Have we got any building biologists in the room today? So the building biologists are these amazingly savvy people who can come into your home and do all these tests and say, guys, your home is cool, or there's dangerous stuff going on here, either from a mold point of view, or a chemical point of view, or an electromagnetic point of view. And they say that there's a slight risk between 0.02 to 0.1 microtesla, but once you get over 0.1 microtesla to 0.5, the risk goes up, and above 0.5 is extreme concern, and that can also be measured in milligauss. Okay, anything over 1 milligauss, and my little recorder here was 10 milligauss. When I'm on top of the screen, 10 milligauss coming down to, right now I'm 7 milligauss, which is extreme concern. Look at that. Okay, let's move on. Low frequency doesn't only have to be electric fields, it can be magnetic field. Magnetic fields and electric fields can all be low frequency. But when it's electric fields, we measure it in volts per meter. V per M, volts per meter. And you can see no concern is less than 0.3, greater than 1.5 is concern. And you will see on the Wilson's Creek document, most of the houses were above 1.5, and above 10 is extreme concern. For that we use a different meter. This is, with me, turn it on, turn the volume up. So So where I'm standing, the microphone, is anybody? I'm bionic at the moment. Okay. So this is it. Sometimes things are electronic that we don't even know. Like when we're using our cursor without a cord. That's electronic. When you're sitting in front of your television and you're scrolling up and down looking at different programs, that's electronic. So radio frequency is probably the most important measure. And this is in microwatts per meter squared. Be very careful when you're looking at an industry document because it will often be in milliwatts per centimeter squared. So a milliwatt is 1,000 times bigger than a microwatt. And if it's in centimeters, you've also got to times that by 100 to get to microwatts per meter squared. So for example, the power density of radio frequency, this is just to measure radio frequency, normally less than 0.1 is no concern, 10 to 1,000 is severe concern, greater than 1,000 is extreme concern. We are told, according to the standard and according to ICNIP, that we can be exposed to 10 million microwatts per meter squared, and that is of no concern, and we can be exposed to that for unlimited periods of time. This is what we're dealing with. Now, if you look carefully, I'll just try and point the cursor over this, that ICNIP say up to 10 million microwatts per meter squared. The EU Parliament and STOA, which is one of the departments that looks at this, is 100 microwatts. Bund, the German building organization, less than 10 microwatts. The Bio-Initiative Group puts it at 3 to 6 microwatts. And the Austrian Medical Association, not the Australian, the Austrian Medical Association puts it at less than 1 microwatt. In nature, they're about 6 decimals less than 1 there. That puts it at about 1 millionth of a microwatt per meter squared. So, I don't know if you can see that. I know the numbers are very small and they're small for me too. If you look in this column over here, this is where you have the RF, the radio frequency in microwatts per, I think it's milliwatts per centimeter squared. Sorry, I can't make that bigger. But I'll just read from my notes on the side that there's 6,750 microwatts per meter squared for the most exposed houses. These are these houses in the middle here. And remember, 6,000 is 6 times over the highest limit of that 1,000. And safety should be less than 10 microwatts per meter squared. So this is a 600 times increase over the safety level, which has been documented by many organizations.
And is that caused by towers or people's devices?
No, this will be caused by the tower. This is the prospective exposure from the radio frequency. And also the volts per meter in this column over here. If I get the cursor going, the volts per meter for a number of houses are also going to be above that. And you can see it's referenced at the bottom as well. But just the principle, don't worry about the numbers. The principle is the important thing.
And what distance?
The distance can be somewhere between 200 to 400 meters is the highest exposure. And just to show you how ridiculously insane the exposure from 5G is going to be, this was a project that Raymond and I were working on for some people in the Sydney area. A 5G, it's very clever. The 5G base stations are tiny little boxes like this, put up on a street pole. They look really innocuous. But when we looked at the paperwork, which I'm not sure if it came out clearly, but let's get the cursor. The exposure was 207 milliwatts per centimeter squared. That equates to 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And that is considered safe. And this was going to be projected directly into this house where this little girl and her parents sleep bedroom next to each other, 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And the volts per meter was also way above what is considered normal. Okay, now because of the craziness with the computers, the Bio-Initiative Group have done some amazing charts on the exposure effect on human beings and on animals, a lot of the things that Victor was speaking about, from ridiculously low levels, from levels way below 1 microwatt per meter squared, way below 1 watt per meter, 1 microwatt per meter squared, and going right up into these sort of dangerous zones within the so-called safety spectrum. And the Bioinitiative report covers this across all domains in medicine. So there's an extraordinarily large amount of data. Are we on the same page here, where the authorities tell us one thing, but we know that animals are being affected, plant life is being affected, trees are being affected. I heard from Steve that trees are dying. Trees are dying, that the trees closest to the tower are dying. But the standard allows us unlimited access. So let's go visit some RF emitting towers and decide if we would live there. So there's this extraordinary study done in Brazil. The study is called Mortality by Neoplasia in Cellular Telephone Base Stations in the Belo Horizonte municipality. They had a large number of deaths. And to cut to the chase, you can see the largest accumulated electric field measured was 12.4 volts per meter. Now you understand, anything over 1.5 is risk. And the smallest was 0.4. And the largest power density was 40.78 microwatts per centimeter squared. But that equates to 4,780 microwatts per meter squared. And that's way above what would be considered healthy. And so, I don't know, in this municipality picture, all the red dots is where these base stations were, and the crosses were unfortunate deaths. And you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's an accumulation of deaths around these base stations. And you can see on the extreme left how the death rates decreased as they approximated 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters away from the base station. In Netanya, in Israel, they found that a study was done on how many people was it? About 622 subjects who developed cancer compared to 622 subjects living in an area close to the tower compared to controls, 1,222 controls away from this tower. And they measured them a year before the tower came on and then measured them during exposure. And they found that there was a 4.15-fold increased risk of developing cancer. There was an extraordinary study done in Styria, in the district of Styria in Austria, municipalities of Hausmann, Statten and Wasselsberg, where they looked at people in an area of 1,200 meters away from a base station, starting off with a 200-meter inner radius and out to 1,200 meters across 3 exposure times, so what they call the latency period, which is beforehand, and then during and an after period, or an after effect period. And what was found that the people living close to the tower had a much higher risk of cancer. But more than that, it was not only the distance from the tower, but also the power density measured in microwatts per meter squared. And again, they found that those that lived in a density of greater than 1,000, if I can find the cursor, greater than 1,000 microwatts per meter squared, had a 23 times increased risk for breast cancer. You know how they say, but wait, there's more? For brain cancer, there was 121 times increased risk. I don't even know how much percentage. You can't, that's thousands, tens of thousands of percent increased risk. Okay, and here you can see it. The left-hand column, less than 10 microwatts, there's no increased risk across all the measurement areas. So all cancers, breast cancer and brain cancer. But as you move off to the right-hand side, as that power density increases, and especially when it goes above 1,000 microwatts, one's in big trouble. Similarly, there was a study in Germany in the town of Naila in Oberfranken. This is a remote little town with very little industry, very little electronic industry. And they found again that people living close to the tower were at an increased risk. But this risk was threefold higher in the 5 to 10 year period. So the longer the exposure, the closer you are, and the stronger the density of the current, the more exposed you are to frequency. So risks of increased cancer under 400 meters from a cell tower. Okay. And again, this just shows the data compared to around the tower compared to, I'll just bring my cursor, that is elsewhere in this little town that was a long way away from the tower. Okay. And so the epidemiological evidence for health risks from a mobile phone base station. This was a study by Professor Binney, and he found that 8 out of 10 epidemiological studies reported adverse neurobehavioral symptoms or cancer in populations living less than 500 meters. Now, we drove through this beautiful little town of yours, and there's a huge tower just across the way here. I reckon we're not more than 500 meters away from it. So if you have a house right here, you are putting yourself in harm's way.
So that'll be the town. This is school.
I know this is a school, but what I'm saying is if you lived right here, you're putting the kids in harm's way, and you're putting yourself. Yeah.
People died the other day.
Yeah. And this is why we are all so passionate about this, because we want to protect the ones we love. We want to protect our children. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect our friends, our family, our community. We want to protect the environment. We want to use this stuff, but we want to use it safely. And if we can't use it safely, I, for one, would go back to dial-up. I would hardwire. I would be prepared to hardwire and drive long distances, because at least we know we're safe. Steve's beautiful place up in the hills, up in the hinterland where we stay, is absolute paradise. If we can evoke that sort of paradise up in the hills in our own lives, knowing that we are drinking beautifully clean water, everything is vibrating with radiance and love and harmony, and we can live like that, then that to me is exceptional living. And I don't think we should settle for anything less than that. So let's see, we know this stuff now. So let's look at some of the symptoms, because this is what I deal with every day, the symptoms. Nausea, headache, dizziness, irritability, discomfort, nervousness, depression, sleep disturbance, memory loss, lowering of libido. Okay, no offense to my colleagues, to GPs, but if you go into a GP with symptoms like this, what do they say to you? You will normally get a prescription or be sent off to the psychiatrist. We need to do the hard yards. We need to upgrade our skills. We need to listen to our patients. We need to deal with their difficulties and not think that these are irrational people with irrational symptoms. These are real people like you and I, who are sensitive, who are passionate, who are vibrant people, and they are in trouble. And we are not listening to them, and that's a travesty of the system, of the political system, of the personal system. We need to up our skills. So let's look at the European Parliament back in 2001 already had recommendations to protect. They realized that there are problems from radiation and changes need to be made following the German Building Biology Institute's recommendations. The safety limit for power density in bedrooms should be below 10 microwatts per meter squared. Okay. A moment ago I spoke to you about 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And the UK Parliament in 2007, they actually listened to the authors of the Bio-Initiative report, the 2007 Bio-Initiative report, and they put things in progress so that the UK Council's IPNIRP guidelines of 1999 could be upgraded using the information from the Bio-Initiative report. And in 2011, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, this is 47 countries whose goal is to protect the safety and the well-being and the democracy of their people, they put out a document adopting the potential dangers of electromagnetic fields and the effect on the environment. It's great. But it's only the start, because this has to be implemented, and it just appears that it's not being implemented. We're going to change tracks for a moment. We're going to talk now about a fascinating illness called EMF syndrome, also known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity. How many people in this room, if you've got to work on your computer for a few hours, or if you've got to stay on the phone, or people who use a portable phone because it's so handy, isn't it? But it's an absolute disaster, because if you put that portable phone to your ear, you are in big trouble. How many people notice the sensitivity in this room? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. But some people are exquisitely sensitive to the point that if they know if you have your mobile phone on in your pocket. Okay. I have a lady that Raymond and I have been looking after in southern Tasmania who went to live there because she initially had chronic fatigue syndrome, which some people in this room may well have had, because my experience is that the people who are electromagnetically sensitive and who have multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome, the chaos starts with chronic fatigue syndrome. There's a dysfunction of immunity and dysfunction of the mitochondrial system, which means they haven't got energy to detoxify, they haven't got energy to think. The liver isn't working, the bowels aren't working, the muscles aren't working. Okay. These people, in my experience, are hypersensitive to electromagnetics. And in the Swiss study, they found that a lot of people who answered that they had symptoms, base stations were the biggest culprits, cell phones, obviously cordless phones, and high voltage power lines. And absolutely routers, Wi-Fi routers, yeah. But at the time, Wi-Fi routers weren't out. Okay, but this is a much maligned illness. If you go to Wiki and you read about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, these people are considered to be psychological misfits. Their symptoms are all made up. They've got a somatization syndrome. Basically, it's a polite way of saying you're off your face. You're not, this is a psychiatric illness. However, the Austrian Medical Association, who I applaud, I think they're the first medical organization who realizes that there is a problem. And the problem is that these people are having genuine symptoms, and as I said, you can see chronic fatigue, multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, and there is actually a biological mechanism, and that's what I'm actually going to talk with you today. And the mechanism is what we call, we all know the word oxidation. You know what happens if you leave your car down at the sea? It rusts. And what is rust? It's oxidation, it's damage, it's breakdown, it's destruction. Well, we get destroyed, we get damaged, we get broken down by oxidative and nitrositive stress from the combination of superoxide and nitric oxide, forming this insanely dangerous substance called peroxynitrite. And peroxynitrite is a biological terrorist. It basically blows up and destroys. It leaves a path of destruction. And when this happens in our brain, we have neuroinflammation, neurooxidation, neurodegeneration. How would that make you feel? Do you think people would complain of nausea and dizziness and headache and lack of energy? 100%. And in Sweden, as I said, the EMF syndrome has been recognized, and they now have a special resolution. It's part of the UN Charter. And employers who have got electromagnetic hypersensitivity get special compensation from the Swedish government. I wish our government would see what the Swedish government are doing and look after the thousands of people who have electromagnetic hypersensitivity, because these people are suffering extraordinarily, and they get turned away from GPs, they get turned away from specialists, and they have no one to turn to. If you can't trust your doctor, who can you trust? You don't know where to go. And so the Austrian Medical Association has an algorithm for these patients. And it's the obvious things. You do a thorough history. You examine them. And then you do specialized blood tests. Geez, my hand is actually burning from this thing. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay. They have a protocol for doctors how to assess patients according to their EMF exposure. These people have sleep problems, fatigue, exhaustion, lack of energy, restlessness, heart palpitations. Look, I mean, it's cool. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, but there is a wealth of biochemical data. There's a wealth of biochemical data we can get from our patients. Beyond, you know, when you go to your GP, they do the basic. They do full blood counts, they do urea electrolytes, they do liver functions, they do a vitamin D, they do a B12 and a folate. If you're lucky, you'll get a homocysteine. You'll get a TSH, a thyroid stimulating hormone. And if you've had issues with weakness and fatigue, you may get your iron studies done. But that's basically it. And if that comes up clear, you're good to go. Irrespective of your symptoms, you're good to go. Now that for me is not good enough. And so I've studied long and hard to research this. And this group, like the Austrian Medical Association, introduces us to all these new tests that are available. We look at, get my cursor over some of these things like intracellular glutathione levels, myelaldehyde, it's almost unpronounceable, which is a free radical marker. We look at some of the, we look at 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. I'll be discussing this in a moment. This is a DNA damage marker. We've actually got a marker that can show the degree of damage to your very DNA, to your very genetic code. Scary stuff. Okay. I'll just try and skip through. And so again, they give the low frequency references, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner, so greater than 400 nanotesla. Remember, nanotesla, which is greater than 0.4 microtesla, they say is very far above normal, and that's in line with those leukemia studies. So when you're looking at magnetic measurements, anything above 0.4 is a problem. Whereas when you're looking at low frequency alternating electric fields in the middle, we're looking at volts per meter. And they say above 10 is very far above the reference range. And again, less than 0.3 would be considered okay. And what we deal with all the time are the high frequency, radio frequency fields. And here, as we're now learning, greater than what amount is dangerous? Greater than? Okay. So greater than 1,000 would probably put you in harm's way, but it would be best to have exposures less than 10, and for children, probably even less than 1, down as low as 0.3 microwatts per meter squared. Okay. So, wow. Okay. So what do they suggest? They use the word disconnecting. We're always trying to connect. For once in our life, we're going to disconnect. So when you go to bed, you disconnect as much as you can. You even go to the power box and turn off the switches in the power box. You turn off circuits. The last person who goes to bed turns off the Wi-Fi if you have Wi-Fi in your house. You never keep your mobile phone on you. You keep it always as far away from you as possible. If you have to have it on you, I've got this extraordinary case. I've got this extraordinary case that completely cuts out any radiation to my body. So I can put my phone in the little side pouch like that, put it in my pocket, and I'm safe touching it. But I can still get a signal through the top. So we've got all these amazing little things that keep us functional, connected to the world, but keep us safe at the same time.
Where do you get that from?
There's a company down in Melbourne that has this. Obviously, I'm not here to spruik any companies or any systems, but it's out there. The technology is out there. And what does Opanza say on EHS? Well, they say there's no causal connection between the term electromagnetic hypersensitivity. They're happy for people to have the diagnosis of EHS, but they say it's not in any way connected to radio frequency electromagnetic energy. And that these people may be part of a disorder called central sensitization. And by now you know that that's the problem. So they do what they call provocation studies, and the provocation studies are when you expose an electromagnetically sensitive person to an unseen, seemingly unfelt field. Obviously you can't see the field because we can't see radiation, and they want them to say yes or no whether the field is on or off. And they call that, so correctly discriminating is called electromagnetic sensibility, and getting lots of symptoms is electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But fascinatingly, the authors of this particular study said that although electromagnetic sensibility may be a necessary precondition for EHS, it is certainly not sufficient, as there is evidence that healthy individuals can display heightened sensibility without necessarily experiencing symptoms. So you're doomed if you get it right, and you're doomed if you get it wrong. This is how sometimes, dare I say, corrupt research can be. So let's look at the stuff that I'm passionate about, which are the biological markers. Because when you've got a biological marker, you take it out of the realm of psychology, you take it out of the realm of somatization, you put it straight back to the biology of the person, which you can't change. You can't change these numbers. Okay, so what they found, reliable disease biomarkers that came from the Belpome study, was that histamine levels are increased. What is histamine? Histamine we normally think of as an allergic reaction. Kids who get, all of us, you may be stung by a mozzie, and there are a lot of them up here in summer, or you may get stung by a bee, you get a swelling, a redness and an itchiness. That's the release of histamine, driven by an immunoglobulin called immunoglobulin E. So they find that histamine levels are increased in EHS sufferers. A substance called nitrotyrosine, which is a marker of oxidative stress. It's basically that extraordinary substance, dangerous substance called peroxynitrite, damaging brain proteins and releasing, and then this damaged protein is called nitrotyrosine, which you can measure in the blood now. There's a substance called protein S100B, which is in high levels when somebody has what's called blood-brain barrier permeability. The brain is sacrosanct. God, existence, nature made the brain to be safe and protected, not only from outside dangerous influences, but from the body as well. Nothing gets through to the brain unless it's determined to get through. And when blood-brain barrier permeability increases, it means that toxic substances from the body can get into the brain and pollute the brain. And what happens is we now have a marker for that. Blood-brain barrier permeability goes up in people who've got traumatic brain injury or have been exposed to extreme toxic substances. Believe it or not, EHS is a toxic, electromagnetic radio frequency is a toxic substance. Hence the first slide I put on, which is toxic biology. We can be poisoned if the field is too strong, if the closeness to the emitting source is too close, and if we're in it for too long, we can then have these dangerous markers going up in our blood. O-myelin autoantibodies go up. What are autoantibodies? Autoantibodies are substances that the body starts producing to attack itself. The body is attacking itself. Exposure to electromagnetics can cause damage to cells such that when they reproduce, what comes out is not a normal cell anymore. It's what's called a dysfunctional epitope. It's a cell that doesn't perform the functions it's meant to perform. And so these O-myelin autoantibodies. So what's O-myelin? Myelin is the sheath around our nerves. If we've got antibodies to the sheath of our nerves, what do you think that means? It means the conduction through our nerves is affected. The ramifications are enormous. We've probably all heard of the word melatonin. What is melatonin? It's an extraordinary hormone produced by the pineal gland. And melatonin is almost like the master hormone of the gland, of the body, nourishing, supporting, protecting. Not only does it correct our circadian rhythms, but melatonin is a standalone antioxidant, a standalone anti-cancer agent. Most extraordinary substance. Now, what has been found in 100% of the subjects measured in this particular study of 727 people, every single person had reduced levels of melatonin.
Wow.
The authors also did you've all probably heard of or done or had an ultrasound investigation where you can actually do ultrasound of the cerebral artery. The study is called a tomosmigmography. Ridiculous word, but basically measuring the perfusion of blood across the cerebral vessels. What they found is that there's a difference, that there's hyperperfusion, not enough blood going into the capsulothalamic area of the brain, suggesting an inflammatory process. And so in the new Bell-Poem paper, just published, if you look at the bottom, like just a few weeks ago, they've also found now that thiobarbituric acid reactive substances are also raised in these patients. We've spoken about MDA, which is also for damages fats or lipids, so we call it's a measure of lipid peroxidation. But also glutathione, which is our body's major defense antioxidant, levels of what we call reduced glutathione. It's almost like an oxymoron, reduced glutathione, but reduced glutathione is good glutathione, as opposed to oxidized glutathione, which is bad glutathione. So the ratio between reduced glutathione to oxidized glutathione drops, which is not good. That means that all our good stuff is being used up and there's very little left. 30 to 50% of EHS sufferers had raised T-bars, raised MDA, raised oxidized glutathione, and raised nitrotyrosine. And glutathione-associated biomarkers, the good unused glutathione was reduced. Okay, and additional markers like vitamin D. I think I can put my phone down now. Are you enjoying this stuff?
It's shocking. It's shocking.
So we can also do levels of vitamin D, we can do levels of circulating IgE, we can do what's called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and 71.8% of EHS sufferers have at least nitrotyrosine or IgE or protein 100B elevations. And so that's why I say this is a biological condition. And remember, these guys are the canaries. They are at the forefront. They are super sensitive and they're being affected now, which means that, God forbid, we're all going to be affected at a later date. So we need to take heed of these people, look after them, protect them, understand what we don't understand yet, and make sure that it doesn't affect us. Let's look at some of I've actually been working with a laboratory down in Melbourne, and we've actually got these tests. They are in Australia and they are ready to go. And these are obvious. One can get the top ones in any laboratory like HSCRP, vitamin D, IgE, and histamine. But what you can't get, the nitrotyrosine, the heat shock proteins. I haven't spoken about heat shock proteins. Heat shock proteins are like our biological angels. When something goes wrong, they're out there protecting us. They're preventing our cells from going through what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. They're making sure that we stay on track and we stay on the path. And what happens is the body has this amazing sense of adaptability. So what happens is when we're exposed to oxidizing stress, our heat shock proteins go up. But when you're chronically exposed to oxidizing stress, what do you think will happen? They will drop. And then we get absolutely hammered. So the longer the exposure time to oxidizing stressful influences, the more strain you put on your body, and the body begins to decompensate. Okay, and so also from Bell-Poem's paper and from the European paper, European is the European Academy of Environmental Medicine. There are some damage markers. We can do what's called the cytokine panel at the bottom, which are these immune inflammatory markers, and many of these are often raised. So we basically discussed this already. Neuroinflammation. I've spoken to you about melatonin and how it drops precipitously. That in the new Bell-Poem paper, they discuss EHS and MCS. Remember, MCS is multiple chemical sensitivity, as possibly being what they call a sentinel pathological disorder, meaning that after doing a meta-analysis, which is taking all these multiple studies and looking at the central themes amongst them to see if they have any objective statistical significance, that looking at 22 studies for prolonged exposures to extremely low frequency electromagnetic fields, that there was a very high association with Alzheimer's disease. Scary stuff. And what they suggest is EHS and MCS need the World Health Organization International Classification of Disease Status, called the ICD, because once they receive the status, then this will be the basis for clinical and pathological description. It becomes a bona fide condition that then goes out through, legislation, and people can be looked after. So this is what happens. I had a lady through Steve who said to me, look, I suffer from EHS and I had this test done. This is what's called a functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. There's a different, MRI is like a sophisticated form of a CT scan, but there's a component of it where we can actually look at the moment-to-moment lighting up of the brain in different areas. That's called a functional MRI. And without doubt, 100% of patients who proclaim to have electromagnetic hypersensitivity all had an most unusual pattern in the front of their brain. And so again, this attests to the fact that there is something really happening. We've spoken about the standard. Okay, so the interphone study. So Victor spoke a lot about the interphone study, and I will reiterate what he said. This was a study done across 13 nations. They looked at about 2,500 people with glioma and an almost similar amount of meningioma, 2 different brain tumors. But unfortunately, this was a case-controlled study, but unfortunately it was a study, a retrospective study, where they were simply looking at whether people were subscribed to a telecommunications company. But at the same time, they did look at the amount of time they spent on the phone, but as we heard, in this day and age, we spend much more time on the phone. They actually cut off, they truncated people who said they spoke for more than 5 hours. They said, well, that's impossible, and they truncated that. So if somebody spoke for 12 hours, they said, you can't speak on a phone for 12 hours, so we'll do a cut-off at 5 hours. And then the extrapolation of the data. So there's, unfortunately, we would hope that a scientific study cannot be sort of changed or altered. But unfortunately, things like this happen. The long and the short of it is, irrespective of how this was truncated and shorted, greater than 10 years and more than 1,640 hours, there was an increase. There was a 33% increase of brain tumors. And that was on a very small amount of talk time and length of time on the phone and the overall number of calls done. So confounding variables. Okay. Interestingly, the Alpanza epidemiological update, they recognize that there was a small increase in certain kinds of brain cancers, but they say amazingly, they agree, limitations of the methodology, including recall bias of phone use, prevented conclusions of causality. Their recall bias was the patient didn't know which side of the ear they used their phone. So the ipsilateral side being the side where the tumor was caused, and being the same side as where the phone was held, it was thought that there was bias. I mean, how do you not know which side you're using your phone? Okay. So also the acoustic neuroma. Acoustic neuroma is a tumor in the ear area. The data on this was withheld for 7 years after the study was completed. And the data again showed that there was an increased risk of acoustic neuroma. And remember, that's on very limited talk time. So yeah, for me, you've got to be kidding me, because only 10% of the subjects had additional telco phone records. Only 10%, not 100%, only 10%. And believe it or not, the study showed that people using mobile phones, regular users of mobile phones, and a regular user could be somebody who you were classified as a regular user if you use the phone once per week. Once per week?
Yeah.
Once per week. 12 times a year. Or 12 times, it will be a bit more than that, about 50 times a year, but once per week. And they were considered regular users.
Yeah, that's right.
So it must have been once a month. It was once a month, because as little as 12 times per year. Okay. irrespective, it was ridiculously low, and they're comparing those people to high users and expecting to get a normal result. You're not going to get a normal result. Okay, so let's go through this. There's an extraordinary gentleman called Lloyd Morgan in the US. He's an electronics engineer. He's written a treatise on this interphone study. It's been co-authored by people, and it's been endorsed by world-leading experts, medical experts, professors, even professors in Australia, Vinnie Kurana, Professor Charlie Teo down in Sydney, and another whole page of endorsements. And he did a 15-point concern as to the relationship between cell phones and brain cancer. And I'll just go through them very quickly. Industry knows that phones cause cancer. There's internal scientific data on this. But also industry-funded studies, more often than not, show no relationship between cancer and cell phone use. Let's see what else I'm going to pull out. I'll move through that. Okay, this is fascinating. Independent research shows that there's an increased risk of brain tumors. Professor Hardell in Sweden found that the risk of tumors increases every greater than 10 years, and this we've heard, not only from cell phones, but from cordless phones as well. But for every 100 hours of cell phone use, the risk of brain cancer goes up 5%. And for every year of cell phone use, the risk of brain cancer goes up another 8%. And more than 10 years of use of digital phones, 280% risk of breast cancer. And our children are even more at risk, being 420% increased risk. Okay, and then he goes through systemic protective skewing of the data. Simply said, fudging of the data, dare I say. Okay, and then industry-funded studies we've discussed. Okay. All right, and so on and so forth. I think you get the message. Okay. So let's move past this.
So if you have more than 100% chance of getting brain cancer, that says you will get brain cancer.
Well, you know, we're all very adaptive, amazing people. And we do the most. We eat well. We try to go to sleep early. We try and avoid chemicals and poisons and pollutants. And so we can epigenetically change a risk from a severe risk to a minimal risk. We're not all genetically the same. So some of us have poor antioxidants and some of us have amazing antioxidants. I climbed, I have a friend with me here, we were in Northern America, and I climbed the beautiful mountain, Mount Rainier, and the leader of the climb smoked 20 cigarettes a day. And I went, my God, are you crazy? And he climbed Mount Everest smoking 20 cigarettes a day. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Clearly it's a bad thing, but he must have had amazing antioxidants to protect him from the risk of those cigarettes. That doesn't mean to say that any of us should ever smoke, but it means that some of us are well endowed in some areas and we're poorly endowed in other areas, and you've got no idea unless you test yourself out. And we can now do that. We can actually test you from A to Z, and you can find out how good or how potentially at risk you are. Okay, so we're almost there, guys. You've been amazing. Thank you for listening. Okay, so, okay, do you know what, guys in the room? When you've got your mobile phone in your pocket, guess what's happening? Okay, we're poisoning the very organs that we need to, that, you know, if we are still able to have children, the chance of that happening is very much less. When we look at a study performed by Dr. Agarwal, the study looked at sperm quality and sperm amount, and I don't know if it's very clear, but you can see as the time exposure to electromagnetic radiation increased, the amount in the middle here, let me get my cursor over it, the amount in millions of sperm dropped from 85% down to about 50%. The motility dropped, the viability of cells dropped from 77 down to 42, and the morphology of normal cells dropped from 40 down to 18% as it went above 4 hours. Okay. Again, this is an animal study. When they exposed, somebody in the room mentioned about Wi-Fi, when they exposed animals to normal Wi-Fi, you know, at 2.437 gigahertz Wi-Fi, 24 hours a day for 20 weeks. What they found was, remember I mentioned the DNA damage marker called 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. They found that marker increased in the blood. They also, when they sacrificed these poor animals, the 8-hydroxyguanosine, which is a tissue measurement of the same substance of damaged DNA, was significantly higher in these poor animals. But also the antioxidant substances, catalase and glutathione peroxidase, were reduced. Okay, so you're going to sleep with your Wi-Fi router on tonight? Okay. Okay. So let me talk about these amazing people. These are dedicated specialists who have dedicated passionate and valuable service to protecting fellow human beings. They're part of a group called the Bio-Initiative Group. They're international academic medical experts and also some non-medical experts. And it doesn't mean that if you're medical it's any better than anything else. We're all experts in our area of expertise and we all contribute. But these are specifically to do with illnesses, and what they found is that they put together thousands and thousands of research studies which show beyond any shadow of a doubt the extremely harmful effect of electromagnetic radiation. And their work has assisted the European Parliament for policy decisions in recognizing the harm of EMF. So the Bio-Initiative Group are working tirelessly to try and educate and to inform at all levels of society the risks of radio frequency and also extremely low frequency magnetic and electric fields. And as I said, they put their protective level at 0.3 to 0.6 microwatts per meter squared. Okay, so they've written a letter to the WHO, and interestingly, WHO now has a electromagnetic hypersensitivity core group that does policy decision over electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But interestingly, most of the members are part of IGNOP. So what do you think, what sort of decisions are going to come out of this? Not very good ones. Okay. And these people have a recalcitrant denial of the research. And they have a close association with industry. Now, these are not my words. These are the words of the document. So there's no good, there's just bad, and there's ugly. As far as I'm concerned, when you expose the brain very closely for long periods of time to high power densities of electromagnetic and extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation. And you can see the word ROS, that's reactive oxygen species. That's like the core thing that goes wrong. These reactive oxygen species just go, but this is what I call the biological terrorist of the body. They just go and cause absolute craziness in healthy, biological, organized systems. And some people can end up with EHS in the upper right-hand corner, or they can end up with cancer. And so the experts are trying to alert at both an international and a personal level to reduce your exposure to EMF. Peter Diamandis, who's the chairman and the CEO of the X Prize Foundation, we've been talking about 5G. This guy is saying, and you know, this is more than likely what's going to happen, 5G is going to connect all of us. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, on one level, one might say, well, that's quite a nice thing. But on another level, that opens up Pandora's box of exposure to these electromagnetic fields. He speaks about balloons connecting all of us, all 8 billion of us from space, that they're going to be space-based networks, covering all the light spots. What a beautiful description. When we were at Steve's place today, I call them green spots, but light spots, absolutely. So there won't be any light spots left anymore. Okay. So let's finish off, guys. I think we've done this, eh? We've done this. So the science does not go to establish. Remember, I mentioned this in the Alpanza Standard, where they say the science does not at all establish even indicative parameters on which a precautionary approach may be based. I believe it does. And I think I just stand as one of many, many, many practitioners, many researchers, one of many scientists who undoubtedly believe that unregulated exposure puts us in harm's way. And the reference has to be tightened. We have to be protected. We need to wake up. The death of canaries in 19th century coal mines was the first sign that the miners must get out of that mine as fast as possible because of carbon monoxide poisoning, or our chronic fatiguers, or our electromagnetic hypersensitivity patients, the canaries of the 21st century, suffering and dying while we debate the nocebo effect and whether they got sensitization issues, while this tsunami of electromagnetic promiscuity is engulfing us. We must recognize and rescue those who are injured. We must recognize the research and continue to do research, but it mustn't be overlooked. And we must make the changes regardless of the cost. And using the precautionary principle, if we protect those that are most vulnerable, being our children and those that are very unwell, then we will be protected too. We need to wake up. And thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. We'll open the floor to questions, and then at 6:30 we'll have a break. Just one of the key things I've picked up on here is we're at a school. Mullum High is nearby. There's primary schools and kindies nearby. So we have, within a few hundred metres of the tower, over 1,000 children. And I've heard from the good doctor that they're all very much at risk. And it also sounds like we have biological markers that could prove that they're being harmed. And our next speaker, Barrister Raymond Broomahall, after the break, may talk to some of the criminal and other matters and points of law that can be applied if government and industry won't stand up and protect their own children. Over to the floor. Can I ask people with questions to come up, because this microphone is a bit... Please.
I want to thank you incredibly for this talk. It's been amazing to hear the evidence so succinctly presented, so compactly, but deeper than that, there's something happened in me that has never happened before, of suddenly feeling I'm okay for being judged as hypersensitive. You know, I've had 8 cases of fainting, each of which was under electrical radiation, until they said, oh, it's just in your mind. And then I was unconscious in Singapore airport for 8 hours, and they said, oh, it might be, you know, anaphylactic, or the peanuts, which is actual chemical sensitivities. And then to come home to all my sensitivities started emerging in this time, after I lived at a uranium mine as a mediator for an American uranium mining company, Aboriginal community, 300 electors in the Star Force Police. Since then, allergies, sensitivities, or every symptom you mentioned. Thank you so much.
A very brave woman. Thank you very, very much for that. Thank you. There was something I didn't mention. You know, we all know when we go to naturopaths, or sometimes if you go to an integrative doctor, they may say, hey, you know, let's look at your mouth, let's see if you've still got your amalgams in your mouth. What have you been exposed to? Have you been exposed to lead flashings on our house when we drink our beautiful rainwater? Guess what ends up in our rainwater is lead, cadmium, arsenic. We become polluted, and there's this interface between heavy metals and electromagnetic radiation. And thank you for mentioning that. That's extraordinary. So we need to, and you know, shortness of time and the moment, in the Austrian Medical Association's guidelines, everybody should be tested for heavy metal poisoning. And let me just tell you something about this. The conventional profession hates the word toxic metals. They just don't like it. They will test your blood, and if your blood level is normal, you're considered normal. Do you know that when you're exposed to heavy metals, it's in your blood, and then within a few weeks it's out of your blood, and guess where it goes? It goes to your organs. So it could be in your brain, it can be in your fat, it can be in your liver, but it's not in your blood anymore, unless you're having acute exposure. Living down in Tassie, we got this place used to be called the Zinc Works, which is where they made mercury. And these people would come up to me and say, I've been taken off the mercury cake building place, had my blood tested, and then I'm put back on a week later as my blood level drops. Well, no, the mercury hasn't dropped. Some of it was excreted, yes, but a lot of it has gone into tissues as well. So they still have enormous loads of mercury. So and thank you for this, because just as an acute exposure from like living directly under a tower can cause electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but all these other confounding events that happen in our life, always grossly unfortuitously, but we don't know. We go to the dentist, we have mercury put in our mouth, and we're just like, that's what happened. But we don't know that what was put in was metallic mercury. What finally comes out is methyl mercury, 300 times more dangerous, which can be profoundly neurotoxic, can increase the risk of cancer. It is a non-biological substance. So there's this extraordinary place in the US called Quicksilver, which can measure, especially mercury, probably the world's best laboratory, and they can measure not only mercury, but all these other heavy metals through blood, through urine, and through saliva. And you get a very erudite level. Sorry, Matt.
This question. That's what we asked. Excuse me. Not so much a question as a commentary, but I take to heart everything that you've said, and like I'm sure everybody in this room, I thank you so much for what you've informed us of. But what I just want to remind people of, there is one study done in Australia on a complex environment, and that was done by my favourite canary, Mark Broomhall. And in there you'll see the accumulated effects on wildlife. And when I say wildlife, I mean all the way through to the insects, the microorganisms, the birds, the critters, everything you can imagine. So this whole talk has been oriented towards the anthropomorphic effects on us human beings and the children and the old folks we have to save. But this issue is not about getting Wi-Fi out of schools. You have to imagine the backdrop and the biological effect on the whole of living life, and we have to turn it off. It's our only place to start from. We don't know. I wrote myself to the people who supposedly invented this, though we know that's not true, but they did win a $100 million court case over 10 years, and that's our own favourite CSIRO. And I asked them if they could tell me if there was any such thing as a safe limit, and they refused to answer the question. They gave me a 3-page answer that said nothing, but they would not say no. And so, as far as we know, there is absolutely no safe limit.
Thank you so much. Just simple questions. When you're using a mobile phone, if you put headphones into the phone,
yeah, that's definitely better.
It's better.
Wherever possible, try and have it as far away from your body as possible on speaker. If you can't use speaker for privacy because you're in an open public space, then you can use headphones. And as a last resort, just hold it at the very end point of. It's better to have the person say, or you say, what did you say? I didn't hear you, just say that again. It's better to do that than to bring it closer to your ear.
And then the other thing was, one of very simple questions. If your mobile phone is off, is it
Still
safe?
radiating.
It's not safe.
So if your mobile phone is actually turned off at the power switch, well then it's off. It's not a transmitter anymore. If it's off, it's off. But if, so if it's turned off, it's off, it's dead. Yeah.
And then the other thing was, I live out in the Maynard village. There's a little small cell, little in size.
Sorry, just hold that thought. The battery of the mobile phone can affect us as well. So even though it's turned off, the battery is still radiating. Well, obviously when it's turned off, it's going to be much less. But so what you do is you buy one of your devices. So just go online and Sorry. Look, again, I'm not stroking this device, but this has been wonderful for me because you get a digital reading of volts per meter and a digital reading of microwatts per meter squared. And then, but this is more for radio frequency, which is the higher bandwidth. For the lower bandwidths, for magnetic or electric fields, you get a milli-Gaussian device. And these are cheap, you can get them for like 20 to 50 bucks. And they're amazing and they're cool. They've got a little sound thing on them, you see? You see? And all you need to know, if you're in the orange or red, that's problematic. And then you just need to back away to see how far you've got to go from the device until it stops buzzing. They're not on my website, but I'm welcome to talk to anybody privately afterwards. Yeah.
And then this last question was, I live out in the Maynard village. There's a small cell antenna there. I live about 30 metres from the antenna.
30 metres?
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, so what I heard you say was something. Did you say that the highest point of exposure or danger was within 200 to 300? Or is it right, if you're right under it, is it?
So with small cell antennae, which are the 5G system, it's very close. It's like the first, anywhere under 500 meters you're in trouble. But you're in extreme trouble in the first 100 meters. So these people who were going to have a small cell antenna put up on the corner of their house, and their house in Sydney was very close to the fence, they were sleeping 6 meters away from this, would be sleeping 6 meters away from this, with power densities of 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. It almost makes what's happening at Wilson's Creek, the house is being 6,700 microwatts per meter. This is 207,000 of just one. What about when there are going to be others nearby as well? Intersecting.
So did you say that was off a small cell? Off a small cell, that one?
That was a small cell. Is yours different?
Yeah, it's a small cell.
Well, I would move away.
We feel like we can't stay there, yes, for sure.
And the next speaker will provide information, not legal advice, but information on how you might be able to put up a fight.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I ask about other protective measures aside from the little pouch you just showed us, such as Faraday cages, stuff like that?
But yeah, this is very specialised. So I've got a number of chronic, they are chronic fatigue patients, but they're electromagnetically hypersensitive, who have to sleep in a Faraday cage. What's a Faraday cage? If you look inside your microwave, if you've got a microwave, that is a Faraday cage. So they have to put up like a steel structure around their bed to protect themselves from the disharmonizing effects of electromagnetics, otherwise they cannot sleep. So some people have to go to that extreme, and there are people up in Brisbane, there are a number of advocates for how to get a Faraday cage or how to get one made or bought.
Last question, and then we'll have a break, and you're welcome to approach the speakers with further questions.
You really have overwhelmed me with the number of studies that are there showing terrible effects. Do you think this is just a commercial sort of, squashing of the reality, or do you think possibly there's something deliberate behind this damage to the human race?
Look, I think we should have this conversation privately afterwards. I think we'll leave it at that.
So we'll have a 30-minute break now. Feel free to interact with our speakers, etc. And then Barrister Raymond Brimhall will be on afterwards.
This is terrifying. This
Yeah, and you noticed the impacts.
No, I don't. Because I didn't put my computer at. Because I broke my
Is there a different agenda?
You mean on your Facebook?